welcome to the first episode of Talking Prisoner. My name is Matt Batten. I'm one of the co-hosts of this new podcast. Prisoner was one of the most iconic Aussie TV shows that hundreds of thousands of fans across the globe. Prisoner first aired on, back then it was called Channel O, now known as Network 10. And it was 1979. And the last episode aired on the 11th of December, 1986. It lasted 8 seasons and 692 episodes. Now, just to give you a little bit of history on Network O, it was launched in 1964, and it was owned at the time by Reg Ansett, who was the Ansett Airlines founder. And for a long time, Network O at the time was coming third in ratings against Channel 9 and 7. But in 1979, when Prisoner came along, that all changed, with Prisoner being one of its highest rating shows. It was the first series in Australia to gain a cult following in the United States, Europe, United Kingdom, and Sweden. Even legendary Sammy Davis Jr. was a fan of the show and visited the set of Prisoner, which we'll talk about at a later time. The show was so popular in the USA that by 1980, it had syndication in 8 major US cities, including New York. And this is what I actually didn't know at the time, was it rated higher than the Johnny Carson late night show. Now, for all those that don't know, Johnny Carson was a huge, like Letterman and Leno and all them now. But just to give you an idea of the ratings for Johnny Carson, who was the king of late night TV at the time, his show was known to have 20 million viewers at its peak. So here's this little Aussie TV show in 1980 rating better than the Johnny Carson show. Even though the show finished over 40 years ago, Prisoner is one of the most popular shows, and it's also had a remake made about it called Wentworth, which has become a ratings hit for Foxtel with a new generation of fans, which is also interesting because the fans that have been watching Wentworth are now going back to watch the original Prisoner, which they didn't know about, or probably weren't even born when it came out. Wentworth has won Logie Awards for Most Outstanding Drama Series. There are not many iconic Australian TV shows that have had remakes made. So it just shows you how popular that Prisoner was and the impact that it had on people's lives. Now, the new Wentworth is consistently compared to Prisoner. The first episode of Wentworth was the most watched Australian drama series premiere in Foxtel history. Now in its 8th season, which is its last season, which resonates with Prisoner only going for 8 seasons, makes it the longest running hour drama series in Foxtel history. And this is all owed to the original Prisoner. Now, let's get into what this podcast is about quickly, and then we'll chat to Ken. Ken and I are going to feature guests from Prisoner, cast, crew, anyone that worked on Prisoner, producers, writers, wardrobe, cameramen, everyone we can. We're going to feature each week or fortnight guests and crew and speak to them. We're also going to take questions from fans. So you'll be able to go onto our Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter, or whatever social media you're using, and post questions, or send us an email at talkingprisoner@gmail.com, and we will answer your fan questions as well. And it's going to be a lot of fun. We're not going to take ourselves seriously here. And I just want to basically first go over how the idea of the podcast came up, and then we will shoot over to Ken. So basically, when I was 2 years old, Prisoner was just in, it was 1979, and I was only 2. But when they were rerunning Prisoner in the 80s, my mother, who was a massive fan of Prisoner, would watch it, and I would sneak out of bed because I wanted to watch it. I'd be behind the couch, peering through, watching Prisoner, which I'm sure a lot of other fans did at the time. And halfway through, my mum would just say, come and watch Prisoner. Not the show that a kid should be watching, but we did. Then during the pandemic last year, I had a bit of an idea of a podcast for Prisoner because no one was actually, talking about it and going behind the scenes, which I think is important. So I had the idea of this podcast, and my next thing was, who am I going to host it with? Who has got the knowledge and the information about this show? Been so long ago. And it was then I thought of Ken, but it did take me a few days to approach Ken because I wasn't sure what he'd think, if I'm crazy or would he want anything to do with this podcast. And to my surprise, on Facebook, I added him and he accepted. And he said, sure, come around. Let's have a meeting and go over it. And I was absolutely excited because it's just a thing that I've always wanted to do. And I love the show dearly. And I'm really excited to be hosting this with Ken. And that's how it came about. It was just one meeting we had. And here we are, and we're filming. Now it's with the greatest honor, I would like to introduce the legendary cameraman and the man who was on Prisoner from episode 1 to 692, Ken Mulholland. Now, Ken has been on a lot of other Australian iconic TV shows, including Neighbours, The Sullivans, Matlock, Homicide, the original Homicide, and here he is. I'd like to introduce Ken to the Talking Prisoner podcast.
G'day, Matt. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
As I said, I'm fighting fit.
Excellent.
Fire away.
Okay, so let's learn a little bit about Ken. Where did you grow up as a child?
I grew up in a place called West Heidelberg. My parents moved there when I was about 4. So up until I got married, which was in 1970, I lived in West Heidelberg.
And that's where you sort of remained for the good part of your life?
Well, in West Heidelberg for all of my younger years up until I was 25, I think it was, when I got married. And then I moved.
And then you moved. And what was one of your first jobs?
Well, my first job was as a messenger boy for Channel 7 in Melbourne. So I went all over the city, up to the Herald and Sun Weekly Times, down to 3DB, Crawford's, when they had their production company in the city in Collins Street, DYT, which was Dargie, Young and Tilbrook, which was a group who did other productions, an outside production company, and they were above Thomas's Music Store in up opposite the old Southern Cross Hotel. So I travelled the city a lot, on foot mostly.
So you would have got to know all the people in the industry going to all these places.
Well, yeah, because I had to go to different places. So in Crawford's, you would bump into various different people like Hector Crawford and others. And at the Herald, one of my jobs was to go downstairs underneath the Herald where all the big printing presses were, where they churned out the Herald and the Sun newspaper. And it was very noisy back in those days. We're talking 1961, and no ear muffs, no, very little in the way of protection for people. You had to know your way around. And I would get a big bundle of newspapers, get on a tram, take them down to Channel 7 and run around the building and give them to all the executives and important people.
So is that where you got your, what can we call it, your taste to want to work in TV by doing that job?
No, I wanted to work in television long before that. I wanted to work in radio. Before television ever happened, I was fascinated by, everything about, it was like the movies, but you couldn't, we could watch the American movies, the English movies and so forth. The movie industry here was fairly quiet in the 1940s and 50s. So I never aspired to do that, but radio was within my grasp. And I grew up on Graham Kennedy on radio with Nicky and Happy Hammond on radio, and a lot of the local talent that came into television came from radio. And so once television happened, and I was about 12 in 1956, I thought, wow, that's the place I want to be. I don't know what I can do, but I just want to be a part of it. I answered an advertisement when I was still at school, at the Heidelberg Technical School, for someone to work for 2 weeks to give the mailroom guy or the messenger boy a couple of weeks holiday. So I answered it and I got it. And so I worked for a couple of weeks when I was still at school. And I thought, this is it, this is fantastic. I got to see things like Lady for a Day with Larry Nixon and, old shows, and Sunny Side Up. I went out to the Fitzroy Tally Theatre and I was just amazed. It was wonderful. And so I thought, I have to go through another year of school and then I'm going to apply again and see if I can get the job, which I did, and I did get it. And so then I became the messenger boy for Channel 7 for about the first 18 months. And then eventually there were a lot of camera crew that went overseas. And back in those days, you didn't fly, you went by boat. And so they were going to be out of the country for quite some time. And I got a spot on the floor working as a staging hand and also hauling cables for the big crane camera out at the teletheatre, which you had to be very careful of because it would sometimes run over those cables and stop production. But it was a responsible job, although it was a pretty dirty job, but it was a way in, it was a foot in the door. But then after that, I gradually became part of the camera crew. I was only initially very inexperienced, very nervy, very scary, but I still managed to do ordinary things like the news and league teams and things like that. I was painting back then, and Happy Hammond at one stage of the game interviewed me on TV and got me to bring some paintings in for him to, to show. He was a very nice guy, Happy. He was a lovely bloke and a lot of fun to be around. And then when I got the chance, when Channel O opened up in 1964, I got to know a few people out at Channel O. And a friend of mine who worked at Channel 7 had already transferred over to Channel O. And he said to me, look, you should come. Quit Channel 7 and come over to Channel O. And I did in 1968. So I was 7 years at Channel 7 and then in 1968 to Channel O. And I left there in 1988 and did a bit of freelance work after that for a few years too.
What made you want to jump to Channel O at the time, leaving Channel 7?
Well, look, the thing was that Channel 7 itself, like Channel 9, was a converted building. I mean, Channel 9 was, I think, an old piano factory, and then it became Heinz Soup or something or other. And Channel 7 was the Herald Gravure printers. And so it was converted over into a television station, whereas Channel O was specially built. It was built as a television station. And it had big studios, really big studios. I mean, the teletheatre out in Fitzroy was a big studio, but it was a converted film movie house. And I liked the idea of going somewhere that with new talent and people that I would like to meet, like Barry McQueen and Nancy Cato and people like that. And it had the Magic Circle Club. It had a lot of other things going on, a lot of outside broadcasts. Channel O used to do all the country races, so you could move around and you travel to Moe, or you could go up to Ballarat, or you could go to Bendigo or wherever, all over the place. Not only did we do horse racing, but we also did racing cars, stock cars, mountain climbs, all sorts of stuff. So it was a wider experience to do a lot of other things. And I moved there for the princely sum of $5 a week.
$5 a week? What?
Yes, that was my upgrade in pay. But in 1968, $5 was a bit of money. And so that allowed me to get engaged, or Maria and I were to get engaged. And then we were married in 1970. So I'd been at Channel O for 2 years by then. So
your first day at Channel O must have been a big shock, coming from a studio that wasn't really made for TV to a custom shoot. I mean, Network 10 was its first of its kind in the day.
I was agog. I was absolutely amazed. And I walked around to Studio A, which was a functioning studio, and it was just incredible. It was so big. And it had so much, in those days, modern facilities. And this big cyclorama at the back, which went floor to ceiling, and this huge lighting grid, and it was just wonderful. And it also had a different kind of crane. I eventually drove the Channel 7 crane, which was only a forward-backward crane, and it was a back steer. Whereas out at Channel O, that crane was a back steer crane as well, but it was a crabbing crane, which meant that if you threw a lever, it would travel sideways. So you could travel sideways without having to steer around. You could just travel sideways. So it was a different animal to anything I'd driven before. So I ended up driving that crane on the very first episode of Young Talent Time. Then I worked on programs like The Box and Matlock Police, but that was in Studio B. And when I went there in 1968, Studio B, where Prisoner was later to be videotaped, Studio B was just an empty shell. Okay. It didn't have a lighting grid. It didn't have anything in it. The most modern thing it had in the whole studio was a kitchen sink with water, cold water, no hot water. When we get further on, we might talk about prisoners having showers in Studio B, and I'll tell you about that. But yes, so I did a lot of outside broadcasts. I did a lot of racing, and Melbourne Cup, when that came, when Channel O got that, by then we were in colour. I think colour came in about 1974 or 5, and we got the Melbourne Cup about 1978 or 79. And that was, of course, in colour. Over the years then, I did Melbourne Cups every year. I used to do a camera right down on the finish line, and I was up in a big crane, a 3-stage crane with a camera on the top of that, which was sometimes a bit of a worry in the wet weather because you're right up in the air on this big crane with a big electronic box that you're hanging onto. And if you get a bit of thunder and lightning, it is a bit of a worry.
Which is Melbourne is known for, is thunder and lightning.
Well, especially on the Cup week, because normally you get a very good Saturday, and then the Tuesday for the Melbourne Cup is very good. But then the Thursday for Oaks Day, quite often it rains. And all those young girls out there in their, lovely hats and gowns and so forth have to run for cover. But of course, if you're up in the air in a crane, there is no cover.
Did you enjoy shooting outside, or did you find it challenging because you're in a different environment compared to being inside the studio?
Well, yeah, I did find it challenging. There was one day when I was out doing the Melbourne Cup and I wasn't in that crane for this particular day. I was out in the middle of the race course, up a tower, and I could see it was going to blow up a storm, and there were big clouds coming, and there was a wind channeling down past the stand. And you're very unprotected when you're out in the middle of Flemington Racecourse. And I had this wet weather gear that I was putting on. I had a big yellow jacket that I was putting on with elasticized wrists. I got one leg in the pants with the elasticized ankles, and I heard in my headset, "They're racing." And I thought, oh my God, I had to get myself ready to pick the horses up on the back straight. That was why the camera was out there, because it could get to the back straight. And I suddenly realised that my spare leg of the wet weather gear was filling up with wind, with air. And I couldn't get my leg into the bottom of it. And I just had to fight it and follow the horses all the way around the back straight until they cut to another camera out the front on the stands. But yeah, that was a bit scary. Wow. I thought I might have been parachuting off there without really wanting to. And there were no safety harnesses or anything back in those days.
That's a great insight into, where you started. Now I'd like to go back to where it all began, which was the concept of Prisoner. Reg Watson, who created many shows, including The Young Doctors, Sons and Daughters, Neighbours, and Prisoner. He wrote the first script for Prisoner, which was originally going to be called Women Behind Bars or Birdcage. Had you worked with Reg prior to this?
No.
And there's an interesting story about you, Reg, and Ian at the Burvale Hotel regarding Prisoner.
Yeah, that was Graham Arthur, not Reg. I'd never met Reg.
Oh, sorry, Graham. Okay.
Graham Arthur was the director, and Ian Bradley was the producer. I knew Graham way back at Channel 7. He was the head cameraman when I was just a stagehand. But I got to know him over the years, and he came out, and when he became a director, he directed things like Matlock Police. He also directed a thing called Hotel Story, which lasted a very short period of time, only the matter of a few episodes. And that was shot in Studio B, where Prisoner would be shot. I think we did that in about 1977. And so Graham, I also knew socially via Bob Mallion, And I never lost contact with Graham, and he and I used to get along pretty well. So he got in touch with me and he said, look, I've been asked to direct the very first episode of this production called Prisoner, or, well, we didn't know what it was called then, Women in Prison, or whatever it was going to be called. Well, I think what he said was, I'm going to direct this production with a whole lot of women in prison. And he said, I'd like you to be on the camera crew. And I said, well, that's fantastic. And, you know, because at that time we weren't shooting any drama, and I wanted to do work on dramas or you know, that sort of thing, having worked on Matlock Police and so forth. So he said, look, why don't we make a time and we'll get together down at the Burvale Hotel, which is not far from Channel 10, and I'll bring along Ian Bradley, who's going to produce this series. This was in 1978. We hadn't begun production at all by then. So at the time, I went down there and we had a few drinks together, and I met Ian Bradley. Ian was involved in all sorts of parts of the production, the sets, the lighting, the scripts. He had a finger in all those pies. He is a fascinating character. He's a writer now, but he worked in a lot of various areas for television, including working for Crawford's as well as for Grundy's. So we got together and we were talking away, and Ian was talking about, you know, what the name of this series would be. And he said, you know, there are different thoughts about it, and we haven't settled on a definite for it. In the course of our talking with writers and so forth and so on, we've just called it The Prisoner or something like that. Just, you know, it's an easy thing to remember. And that became what was a working title. But there were still things about, would we call it Caged Women? No, they didn't like the idea of that because they thought that sounded a bit cheap and nasty. Women in Prison, I put in my 2 cents worth and said, well, I like Prisoner. And Ian said, well, yeah, but the problem with Prisoner is that people will confuse it with The Prisoner, which was an English series, which was together with Patrick McGowan, was the star, and I think he had a lot to do with the production of it. And Ian seemed to be worried about whether people would confuse it, Prisoner, The Prisoner. And I said, well, look, you know, for what it's worth, The Prisoner is no longer in production, and Prisoner, even though it doesn't really say specifically women, but it's just an easy thing to remember. And Ian said, yes, well, we've already been talking about it being called Prisoner, but he said it's nice to get some validation on it, you know, and it's an easy thing to remember. Yeah. Well, of course, now in England, it's cellblockh H, Prisoner in cellblockh H, or whatever, which is fine. And there were reasons for changing the name overseas. And I think in America and in Canada, it runs by different names as well. But everybody knows it, and everybody still identifies with Prisoner as such. I think that's just an iconic name. And I was so pleased to be a part of that conversation. It certainly wasn't my idea. And Ian takes the credit for naming it Prisoner in Australia. It was great to be a part of that conversation, you know, talking about it. And I was pretty pleased about that.
At the time, you wouldn't have known that this was going to be such a massive show.
We had no concept of that at all. It was meant to be one series, which was about 14 episodes or 13 episodes or something or other. That's all that any of us conceived that it could be. And of course, after the failure of Hotel Story, which only ran for 4 or 5 episodes, who knows? We didn't even know whether we'd get to do the whole thing. But when we started production, that was a whole new ball game. And that was in Studio B, which I was familiar with by then. It had a big lighting grid already put in there for previous productions, and we were set to go. And the sets were big and took over the whole studio. And I tried to get the measurements of Studio B and Studio A, but I couldn't find them anywhere. But they were very big studios. The Prisoner set was sprawled all over it.
Yeah, and just going back on this set, like I did read somewhere that they weren't going to film it originally at Channel O at the time. They were looking for, prison locations, but it was due to funding and budgets and things, they settled on Channel O. But were people a little bit thinking, how are we going to make a prison? How will this happen? Like, how will we pull this off with the sets?
Yeah, they did think that. But bear in mind that The Box, which was a television series about a television station, and we filmed that in the sets in Studio B in a television station. So it was a television station inside a television station. So when they started looking at the outside of the building of Studio B with those high red brick walls, and they said, gee, we could shoot some of the location. This could be the exterior of the prison. And it didn't take the designers, and I think Ian Bradley was the underlying reason that this happened. And then they decided, well, inside of Studio B, big red brick walls again, floor to ceiling, concrete floor. And they thought, well, yeah, we have to build cells and we have to build corridors and so forth. We can't just have the raw brick walls on the inside. So they built the sets. The corridors were flats, what are called flats, very tall plywood on pine frames, but all the bricks are individually cut and stapled and then laid over with a stippled paint. So they were all individually added, which was a lot of work, I would reckon. And the sets, there were standard stock sets like the laundry set that was only ever the laundry with the big steam press. And that took up a position in the studio. It moved around various times for various reasons, but mostly it was in the back of the studio. The offices and the induction area, where the prisoners come in and stand on that line and sign in and take your fingerprints.
Famous white line.
Do all that. That set was an individual set. The recreation room and the dining room, and sometimes I think also the prison library, were the same set. They were just redressed. Some people will say, oh, well, hang on, the rec room and the dining room can't be the same set because one of them had doors at either end and one of them only had one door. Well, that's simple. You just take out a door at one end and you put in another blank wall and redress it. So there were sets that were reused. As far as how many cells there were, I think probably 3 or 4. It differed and varied episode to episode as to how many cells and what they looked like, because they were redressed as well. So quite often they were changed around to look like solitary cell or a various different kind of cell. Or interview room was a simple little set of its own.
Now, let's get to episode 1, which first aired on the 27th of February, 1979 on Network O, which it was called at the time. Written by Reg Watson and directed by Graham Arthur. And the cameramen that were on this episode were Simon Hellings, Noel Penn, Steve Mann, and Joe Battaglia. And of course yourself, Ken. Have you got a bit of an insight into those camera guys that were on the first episode?
Yes, I do. Simon Hellings was an English guy who came out, and I met him in 1968. So I'd known him for quite a long time. And he worked on the oil rigs. He was a crew member on the Sydney to Hobart yacht race. So he's a guy who built his own yacht. And he was a lovely guy. Noel Penn came over to Victoria from Western Australia, and he did that in about 1970, 71, driving across the Nullarbor Plain, just his wife, his cat, and him. And back in 1971, the Nullarbor Plain wasn't a freeway like it is now. It was just pretty bumpy, dirty, dusty drive across. And we're talking virtually the distance from the west coast to the east coast in America, the same kind of distance. Noel was a tall, blonde-headed guy, still is, And he was a bit of a fancy sort of a cameraman. He could certainly back it up, but he was nicknamed the show pony because of that. And that nickname stuck with him from then on. Steve Mann was a lovely bloke and still is. I'm still in touch with him and his wife, and she worked in makeup, Glenda. And with Steve, he didn't put up with fools too easily. You know, there was one time when we were doing a program called Almost Anything Goes, and it was shot on the front lawn of Channel 10. And it had two competing teams made up of men and women, and they had to go through over this course of water slides and all sorts of things. And we used to shoot it in the daytime on a Saturday. And this particular Saturday, it was very, very hot, extremely hot, about 36, 38 degrees in temperature. And the teams for that day didn't turn up. And the director, who was a bit of a weird sort of a guy, he was waiting for them, and we were all out I was up a tower waiting for these teams to turn up. And eventually the director said, look, we'll rehearse without them. Okay. And we all went, how are we going to rehearse without them? And he said, well, you know, you'll pretend that they're running around and going up slides and so forth, and that's what we'll do. So here we are, there's 4 or 5 cameras. Steve was down below on a portable, and we're panning around this course, and there's no one there. It's just an empty frame. The director's happily cutting away, you know, between cameras and so forth and so on. And eventually Steve got to a point where he just had enough, and he put his portable down on the ground, and the director said to him, Steve, what's going on with your camera? And Steve flicked on his microphone and said, my runner fell over, and flicked off his microphone. And that was it. With Joe Baglia, Joe was a lovely guy. I met him at Channel 9 before I left Channel 7 and came over to O. And everyone knew Joe. Everyone liked Joe. He was a really super popular guy. He came from southern Italy. He had the olive skin and so forth, and he was a really cool dude, you know. One day we were walking down a corridor at Channel O, and coming towards us was this young blonde lady, and I think she said, hi Joe, hi Ken, how are you? And Joe made his usual remarks and so forth, and then she said, oh Joe, you're from Italy, say something in Italian. And Joe looked at her with those penetrating brown eyes that he had and the cool dude sort of attitude, and he said to her, carabinieri, and she was quite, whoa, gee, that's so romantic. What does it mean, Joe? And Joe said, well, it actually means police force. That was his kind of sense of humour. He was just such a cool guy. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, and neither is Simon. Those are stories for another time.
So you must have had a very close friendship with a lot of these guys that were behind the scenes on the show.
We worked together pretty closely and a long time in each other's company. The guys from outside on the location, Joe and Steve, well, we didn't mingle with them quite so much because they were outside and we were inside. But the inside ones, yes, definitely. There was a lot of camaraderie there.
So day one, I mean, what was that like?
Day one was tumultuous. Both Steve and Joe were the location cameramen, and Noel, Simon and I were the interior cameramen. And in that first day, it was tumultuous because we're all getting together, we're all being assembled, and there was a big cast, a lot of main characters, a lot of minor characters, and a lot of extras. It was an interesting experience because most of them and some of the cast were women. So we felt a little bit outnumbered. But we didn't mind that too much because there were some incredible people in that cast. Yeah. And people like Peter Tapano, who I knew of her family. I never met Peter, but I knew of her family because they were all radio names. Lou Tapano and Enzo Tapano were well and truly embedded in my memory of radio. And when I got to meet Peter, I thought, gee, you know, something else here. I didn't realise that she had some acting background in the Young Doctors, I think, up in New South Wales. And Elsbeth Ballantyne, again, I'd had a bit of a crush on her when she was in Bellbird because I was about 16 back in those days. And so to have her in the studio, and then there were others that I'd worked with off and on in other productions and so forth, but I didn't particularly know them very well. What I didn't realise was that we were all going to be together for 8 years. That's a long prison sentence. So you got to know each other a lot more than you would in a fleeting episode of something where someone came in as a special star or whatever and was out again. I mean, we were there, locked in Studio B, day in and day out, 3 days a week, long days, 14-hour days sometimes. And the location guys shot on alternate days. They shot on Mondays on location. We shot in the studio Tuesdays, and then we shot in the studio Thursdays and Fridays, and they did Wednesdays. But they often overlapped. There were times when often they would be out shooting location and we'd be waiting in the studio for actresses to get back from location because they were needed in the studios. So that was why it was tumultuous, because there was so much happening in a week. And of course, the cast would go away and we would have a couple of days off, but they wouldn't, because they would have to read the scripts and learn their lines for the next week. And quite often that took a bit of a toll on them because, you know, they were working almost 7 days a week, especially the principal characters. They had a lot to do.
Just to let the fans know, this was only at the time when it was on once a week, wasn't it? It was at a later stage where it was on twice a week.
Yes.
Yeah.
Initially, but we were always shooting, I think from memory, we were always shooting 3 days in the studios, even when it was only on once a week.
Oh, okay.
And 2 days of location plus crossovers. But when we went to the serialization of it, where we were churning out pretty well twice the amount that we were initially, we just had to work harder because there was a lot more to do. And that's, in a way, why we had to hurry with things as much as possible. We learned to shortcut things, to do things in such a way that it would save time, especially with things like we would shoot out of sequence so that all the scenes in the governor's office for 1 or 2 episodes would be shot out of context, wardrobe changes for the cast, and we would just do all of those in one go. So you might have half a dozen of those back to back, and they might be coming from episode 5 and episode 6, or eventually we were cutting between episodes 6, 7, and 8, you know, and doing them all with the minimum of wardrobe change as possible. Yep. And likewise with all the other sets, the rec room, the dining room, the laundry, they were all shot out of sequence. That was a time saver because you didn't have to move sets, and you didn't have to drag cameras and booms and do all that. The lighting would set up the set for the recreation room, and once it was there, it was ready. And when the set dressers and the props guys had dressed it, we would go in there and we would shoot repetitive scenes in there. The one of Frankie, when she really goes troppo, that one was a very special scene. We knew and we walked it through with Carolburns, and Carol took a while and was somewhat of a method actor. And it took her some time to get herself in the frame of mind to be able to turn herself into this out of control character. So we just walked it through. We also had 3 separate videotape machines for each camera, and we knew that we could only shoot this scene once because it would take too long to redress it and so forth. I think actually that one was shot later on. I think it was in the dining room, but the original one where Frankie goes bananas, well, I think was in the rec room. Even that one, Carol worked herself up into such a state that when it was over, she had to calm down. It took her a while to just get off that plateau.
Wow.
And come down because she was emotionally so locked into it. And then she would be in another scene not too far away where it wouldn't have any context with that particular scene. so she would have to get herself in a different frame of mind, get back to, I can't remember, but it might have been a scene like where Vinegar Tits, the name comes in on that first episode where Fiona Spence opens the cell trap and looks in at Frankie. Yeah. And Frankie's on her bunk in solitary. She lights up a cigarette and Frankie sort of is itching to get to the cigarette. But of course, Fiona, in her character, won't allow that to happen because it's against the prison rules, isn't it?
Regulations, yeah.
So, you've got Carol Burns going from a scene where she's gone completely out of control into something like that scene, not necessarily that particular scene, but like that scene. And so she has to get into a different mindset to do that. So when you've gone mad and then you've got to suddenly go into this chuckling type of character, it's part of that character, but it's a different part of that character.
I noticed in the background, and I saw that at your place when I was there, is the painting that you've done of Peter Tapano. So before we get into episode 1, which we will, Peter is an icon of the show because the very first scene of Prisoner is Karen Travers walking down out of Flinders Street Station, and there she's on the painting that you've done. Can you tell us a little bit about that the fans that are watching this at the moment, what the painting's about?
Oh, the painting I did about 2 years ago in 2019, even though it's got a 1935, this is fake.
Yes, it wasn't done in 1935.
Well, I'm old enough to almost be 1935. No, I saw a photograph of Peter, which she'd put up on her page in Facebook, and it was this much. And I just fell in love with it. I thought, I have to try and paint that. And I hadn't painted a portrait for many years. I actually painted this painting of Peter back in 1981. So I've never painted anyone, any person, twice, except Peter. And I just had to start painting it. And then I painted this much on this board, and I thought, well, I've got another photograph of her wearing a denim jacket. So I'll add that. And then I thought, well, I have all this background. And while I was thinking about that, I was coming up with a story. So she is part of a story set in South America back in 1935. Subsequently, I spoke with Peter and I sent her up an enlarged photograph of this painting and some other things as well. She seemed to be reasonably pleased with what I'd done.
It's just such a beautiful portrait. Obviously, Peter is a beautiful person, but the portrait is it's amazing. Well, hopefully Peter comes on as a guest soon, and we can talk to her, because obviously she was the first person everyone sees on the show. Yeah, so episode 1, I just wanted to go over because you were there on the day. So it cuts to a scene with the prisoners running down the corridor, the famous Wentworth corridors. How many corridors were there? Was there a lot of corridors or just the one?
Initially, the corridors were in an H-type shape. We had corridors running across the studio and down the side and along the back with some cells coming off them. But because you could shoot this from so many different angles, a lot of times the corridors were, because you changed angles, you went around a corner, you shot it back, looking back the other way, etc., etc. Those corridors could be made to look like they were endless. There were junctions where the bars would be slid across, the gates would be slid across. Initially, that first episode or two, there was a centre corridor with a gate that crossed it. And in one of the early episodes, we knew some of the cast, or we knew of some of the cast, but we didn't know some of the others. And Val Lehman as B and a few others I might have worked with, but I couldn't remember very much anything about them. So they were unknown quantities. And of course, once they got into character, they were fairly formidable. I remember on one episode, where they had to come charging down a corridor, and there were, half a dozen or 8 of them. I think Sheliaflorence might have been in there, and Colette Mann certainly, and Amanda Muggleton. And they had to come down this corridor, run a corner, and then charge up the corridor across the set or across the studio, and the gates slammed shut, and they jumped up on the gates and reached through, grabbing. Now, if my memory serves me right, I was the cameraman on that. There were plenty of those, but I think I was the cameraman on that one. So it was going backwards, and you had behind you and alongside you in those corridors, you had an audio guy with a microphone on a pole alongside you. And then behind you, you had all the people, the staging crew and the props guys pulling these cables back. So you had to track back, go around the corner and time it. So you got to the other end so that you were outside the gates with your camera when the doors slammed shut and the women jump up, reaching through. Now, the back of that set was a prison wall, but behind that was the real wall. So there wasn't much gap between the gate and the back wall, me and my camera.
Okay, so Frankie Doyle, played by Carolburns, is standing around the corner of the corridor. She trips over a prisoner and tells the officer that, the prisoner bumped into her. Unfortunately, Carol passed away on the 22nd of December, 2015. Now, this is what I find really interesting and fascinating. She only appeared in 19 episodes of Prisoner, but her character became such a cult status and a fan favorite. Can you tell us much about working? I know you've got an interesting story about Carol on her last day of shooting Prisoner, but can you tell us much about working with Carol?
Well, Carol was totally different, of course, to Frankie, and she took that part. And okay, the writers had created Frankie Doyle, but then you have to have an actor that can step into that character. Because Carol was such a nice, kind, gentle, very soft and feminine kind of person, it's a giant step to actually get into that role and get into it and live it so completely. Now, I don't know whether people know this or not, but Carol actually, because I think she'd come down from Sydney, she actually got herself a little caravan trailer type thing, and she lived in that, in the back lot where the garden, the prisoner garden and so forth, which was in fact a car park out the back for crew and so forth. And she lived in that for the period of time that she was in Prisoner. And she was never really out of jail in a kind of way. She was kind of locked in. I mean, obviously she could travel around and go out to dinner and mingle with other people and so forth. But I don't think that she found it difficult to have herself in the position where she could get out of her caravan and just come into the building and be in Studio B. And it was a kind of a solitary hermit type situation, which I think that she tended to use that in her own way. As I say, she could go out to dinner and socialise with the rest of the people, but it was kind of her way of dealing with something where she was always there on the grounds. And I think that was part of her mental attitude towards taking this part on and slipping into it so strongly that she really became Frankie. I mean, there were a lot of things that were done to Carol to make her more like Frankie: the short cropped hair, the boy type hairdo, the baggy prison garments and so forth. But she was totally different to that.
It was a great character she played. For back then, playing that character, it would have taken a lot out of her to film some of those scenes, like you said, in the rec room where she tore up the room. I'd like to, because I was privileged enough for you to tell me when I met with you, but I'd like to tell the fans about the that last day on set with Carol when she was in the studio while you're all packing up that night?
The set by then, on the very last day she appeared, she'd gone downstairs to the tunnel, which, for fans who don't know, the tunnel was purposefully built under the building, and it ran alongside Studio A and Studio B. And it was for audiences. Early on, there weren't gates and bars and fencing all around Channel 10. It was, when it was Channel O, it was open. You could walk over to the building. And what the audiences would do was they'd drive in and park in the car park, and then they would assemble at a point outside the tunnel. And then the doors would open and they would go in. And in that tunnel, there was toilets, and there was also a little restaurant or cafe type thing where you could buy snacks and drinks and so forth and so on. So somebody from the canteen would come down and audiences would assemble inside the tunnel, and then they would go up some stairs, and that would take them into Studio A. Or if they walked further along the tunnel, that would take them to stairs that would take them up into Studio B. But initially, Studio B was not used. So because of that, and because we needed makeup and wardrobe and everybody close to Studio B, as close as possible, whereas makeup and wardrobe were all on the other side of the building outside of Studio A. So what they did was they closed off the tunnel from Studio A stairs, and they built a wardrobe and makeup section down there. Now, there was not much in the way of air conditioning. So if you were smoking and so forth and so on, it could have been a bit tricky. And so on that night, at the end of production, Carol had gone downstairs, and she'd probably been with a few of the cast, and they may have had a glass or two of wine and talked about it. And she was, I think, moved by what she'd been through for those weeks. And she was still coming out of that Frankie Doyle persona and coming back to not being on the premises, living in a little caravan unit out the back, and probably looking at what she was going to do in the future. So while we were folding up, and I think it may have been a Thursday night, she came back up into the studio, and by then the lights were all down, all the sets were darkened, and there were only the house lights on. And myself and an audio guy by the name of Paul Covington were just folding up cables and putting away microphones and so forth and so on. And she came into the studio in her normal civvies as Carolburns, rather than as Frankie Doyle. And we both sort of stopped and said, "Oh, hi, Carol," you know. And she sort of stood there very wistfully. I think that was a point in her life where she knew that she wasn't going to be continuing on. And that was tough for her, tough for me too, just thinking about it. So she said, "Look, do you guys want to go and have a drink somewhere down at the Burvale or something?" And we said, "Well, no, we can't, because we're back here again at 7 o'clock in the morning, you know, for the next day's shoot." So we said our goodbyes to her, and we quietly left the studio and left her basically on her own. And that was the last time I actually saw Carol.
So that's quite emotional. You know, she would have just been there, and just thinking about, I mean, the time that she'd been on the show and the scenes that she filmed. And
that's right.
Yeah. Well, no, she was amazing at that part. I mean, just totally brilliant.
Mm. And I mean, it even reduces me to tears just to think about it all these years later.
I'm sorry it's done that, but I mean, it's great for the fans to know that story and to hear the other side of Carol and you know, Frankie. Yeah. Now we see Vera Bennett, played by the great Fiona Spence, and Meg Jackson, played by Elspeth Ballantyne, escort a prisoner called Sally into her cell. So this is the first time we see a cell on Prisoner. Were they hard to filming? Like, was it the logistics of it with the cells?
Yeah. Well, they were three-sided. So the back wall, the fourth wall, was open to the cameras and the boom operators to get in there. They were pretty tiny, they weren't very big, but a lot of times what we had to do was actually track a camera along a corridor and either go into the room backwards, or follow someone into the room forward. Now, it was a conventional doorway, and what we were using back in those days were big television cameras mounted on big triangular-based, lead-weighted and counterbalanced pedestals. And the difference on either side to get into the doorway without hitting the set was about that much.
Oh, okay.
Not very much. So going in forwards was difficult enough if you were following somebody into a cell, but going in backwards, many times I managed to hit the side of the door. And of course, we had to stop and redo it again.
Yeah.
When I say many times, I mean over the years. I probably wasn't as adept at doing that as Peter Hind, Noel Penn, Chris Adshead. They were very good at judging getting through the doorways. And you had to remember that not only did you have a pedestal to get through the doorways, but you had a guy on a microphone alongside you with a pole and the microphone on the end of it. He would be bringing the characters along the corridor with you, doing the audio side, and you're doing the visual side. And then when they go into the cell, then the guy on the boom would have his microphone waiting for them to pick up the sound there. So that as well was difficult and awkward, because the corridors weren't that wide. They were wide enough for the prisoners to run on either side of a camera. But once you got to the cell door, that was the tricky bit. Inside the cell, a lot of times people say, okay, there's toilets in the cells, and sometimes there's a shower thing arose and so forth. But how do you flush the toilet? Well, a lot of times there was just a button set into the wall, like a stainless steel button that the prisoner could flush the toilet with. But there were times, I think, when the props or set dressers forgot to put that button above the toilet. So sometimes, obviously for the fans, they must have thought to themselves, well, how do they use that toilet? Because there's no chain, there's nothing there to operate it with. But for the most part, I think that people, the set dressers and props guys, remembered and would add it in. And the other question that a lot of people asked about in the cell was there would be a shower square with a drain in it. But they say, well, what were these prisoners meant to do? Just stand there naked so anyone could look through the cell trapdoor and see them? Well, that was, yes, they had to put up with people looking at them in prison in such a situation.
The thing I've really loved about starting this podcast is going back and watching the episodes again, which I'm still doing. And we cut to the scene where the police truck pulls up at Wentworth. And I've got to say, the outside of it, so they've got Peter Tapano and Kerry Armstrong in the police truck, the first prisoners. The outside looks like a real prison. I mean, the barbed wire, the fence, and the big roller door. And I mean, it must have been, to set all that up, it must have taken a little bit of time to make it look like an actual prison.
Yes, well, the very, very clever set designers got to work on that. And of course, some of those gates were real and practical gates. Later on, when we got a bit more security conscious around the actual Channel 10 building, they were functional already, just to make sure that crew cars and outside broadcast vans and so forth, they were all just parked in the lot out the back, not to do with the audience parking, which was down the front of the building. But I think that eventually fences went up and so forth for security of the Channel 10 building. Well, of course, these were then put to use, and they were perfect for creating this look of a prison building. What with the big Wentworth sign that went up above the door and the windows that went in, the windows, to give it perspective, got progressively smaller.
Yes, they went up.
Got into the building to make it look like a very, very tall building. That was a trick of perspective, which the designers worked out.
Those windows are still there to today. Like, I'm not far from Nuttawading, and they're still there.
Yes, some of them, I think pretty well all of them are. I know that at one prisoner event that I and my wife went to a few years ago, one of those barred windows, I don't know whether it was off the walls out the back or one from inside, but it was actually auctioned off to I think it was the 40th anniversary. They were auctioned off, or that was auctioned off at that event. The roller door was actually used for the outside broadcast van at Channel O. And what they would do is they would take the van out and they would use that roller door for scenes for incoming goods or vehicles or whatever to do with prisoner. And the door of the actual entrance to the prison was actually an airlock outside of Studio B. And when you walk through that door and you turn sharp left, you walk through another door and you were in Studio B. That was the emergency exit out of Studio B in case of fire. But they converted that very cleverly to being the entrance door of the prison. Yeah. And then, of course, when they cut to inside the prison where the induction set was, it looked like you'd gone in from outside and stepped into the prison induction area for the prisoners. It was all very cleverly put together.
Definitely. We cut to Karen and Lynn. They're in the reception area. Meg is doing the induction. Meg, the sweet, nice officer. Then we have Vera take over. And now it's where we see how cruel Vera is going to be as an officer. It would have been amazing to work with Fiona and Elsbeth on the very first episode.
Yes, it was, because the contrast was written purposefully to give the two characters their fundamental basics, the good one and the not so good one, the tough screw and the more emphatic, emphasising kind of screw who's really the compassionate one. Yes, exactly. But behind all that, both these ladies were just delightful to work with because they knew what they had to do and they transposed themselves into their characters. And Fiona was totally different again, as Ali was, and they weren't anything like the characters that they were meant to portray. But you're an actor, that's what you do.
We see Vera puts Karen into the showers, which is on the other side of the induction, the reception area, and Karen starts having flashbacks of what she did. Were they actual working showers?
They were working showers, and as I said earlier on, there was only one hand basin in Studio B at the time. So when the shower sets were designed, they actually had a hose that led out of Studio B and across a carpeted area where the pay office, the Channel 10 pay office used to be, and some other offices. And then that hose went into the toilets where there was hot and cold water. And so we had this situation where those hot water taps were turned on in the toilets, in our toilets, our personal staff toilets, and the functioning showers in the set had taps that could turn on and off. So they could start the shower. And one time, the general manager of the channel at that time had just had his carpet replaced. He had his office not far away, and he just had new carpet put in. And one morning he was standing outside and I said hello to him, and he said, "What's this hose doing running across my carpet?" And I said to him, "Well, that's for the ladies in Prisoner so they can shower." And he looked at me with a very strange look on his face, as much as to say, couldn't they do that when they're at home? Or we have showers in the dressing rooms on the other side of the building. Couldn't they have showers over there? I don't think he actually realised that they were mock showers, that they were prisoners and they had to be used in the studio. I think eventually he did wake up to that, but at that time, I don't think he did.
That's hilarious. We move to the scene where we're introduced to Doreen and Lizzie in the corridor arguing. Lizzie, of course, played by the legendary Sheliaflorence, who was just absolutely amazing. I mean, such an iconic actress on the show. And I'm sure as we go on and talk to many other guests and crew, there's going to be a lot of stories about her. Do you have one that you just remember about her that the fans would love to hear?
There are a lot of stories about Sheila. She was such a colourful character. She said herself, I've trod the boards over in England and I've worked with all sorts of actors and actresses and people back in Australia, and I never thought I'd become famous for being a drunken old sot. She used to love to have a stout. It was something that she would bring in a couple of bottles of stout, and she'd have a glass of it occasionally to get herself into the mood of Lizzie. And she and I got along very well. In fact, we got to the point where we used to loan each other books. And I'd sit down with Sheila and have a yarn to her from time to time. She was just a lovely lady. In some ways, there was a bit of Lizzie in Sheila, but there was also the highfalutin Sheila who got a bit more toffee when she was out of character and spoke very well. A lovely lady.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I remember the first time I saw her do it, there was an interview, I think, on YouTube, and I'd never heard her speak out of character. It was completely different to Lizzie. It was like two different people.
Yes, and both Doreen and Lizzie were kind of brought into the series to be not exactly comedy relief, but sort of secondary characters, more in the background. But it didn't take long for people to work out that these weren't secondary characters. These were characters that had a lot more to say and to do. Sheila used to crack us all up at times because she had a devilish sense of humour. She would do and say things that would just break us up. She'd been around for a while and she'd had some grief in her life. She'd lost a daughter at one stage of the game. Her first husband was killed in the Second World War. Her second husband was a Polish flyer, and he was still alive when she was doing Prisoner. But he got sick towards the end of Sheila's run as Lizzie. And one day she brought in this screwdriver. She said it belonged to her husband, this Polish flyer, and that he was so ill he wouldn't need it again. It's one of those interesting screwdrivers because the top comes off it and there's another screwdriver inside it. And then the top comes off that. It's like the Russian doll. So you've got another screwdriver in that. And this is something that Sheila gave to me. She just thought that I would like it and that I could use it. And she knew that I was building another room into a new home that we'd moved into, and she thought of me. And that was a very special sort of thing to think about that.
What a piece of history, though, really. I mean, that's amazing. Okay, so the next scene, and we're still on episode 1, is we're introduced to the amazing Val Lehman, who played Top Dog, B. Smith. We don't know what B is in prison for yet in this scene, but she's on the famous press, which became such an iconic part of Prisoner. I mean, you know, every time there's a TV show on news and they're talking about Prisoner, it's always that scene where B puts Wonky Warner's hand in the press and burns it. How did the actual press work?
I think it was operated by offset by one of the props guys. Now, I've asked around a few times and I haven't been able to actually get an answer on it, but I think it had to do with possibly piped vapour from dry ice kind of situation. Every time the press came down, there was a pipe running to it, and the props guy off the side would operate this mechanism to make this smoke or steam come out of the press. So I think it was probably dry ice, the vapour that came out of it. So it wasn't really hot.
I mean, it was such an iconic part of the show, that press. I mean, we see throughout the 8 years or so that, you know, every Top Dog was on the press, and
it was a genuine press. It wasn't a mock-up. It was the real thing. It was never actually operated.
The next scene, we've got Karen in her cell, and Frankie walks in. Frankie asks Karen what she's inside for. Karen says she stabbed someone to death. Now, we see that Frankie is a lesbian. Now, this would have been groundbreaking TV in 1979. You know, we've seen murders, stabbed to death, prisoner hangs herself, sadistic officers, lesbian. At the time, how did you, were you thinking, well, this is a lot to digest in one episode? You know, we're seeing all these different things.
Yes, it was hitting you in the face pretty hard. I'd had some experience because of television productions like The Box.
Yep.
So for me personally, seeing nudity was something that I could cope with, although it was a bit confronting. But all the things that happened in Prisoner, all coming at you at once, was where it really pummeled you in a lot of ways, because even though you're behind the camera or you're a stagehand or you're a props guy or you're an audio guy, you're all part of it. And we were part of this team. And every time something happened to one of the cast in the story, it had ramifications because you felt it. And that sort of constant blow after blow, when you get the murders, the hangings, all the things that happened in a series that ranges over 8 years, every time when a cast member was killed, especially if it happened in the studio, and I would assume that for the location people, they would have the same thing. When that cast member died, one of them being later on in the series during the siege, when Myra was shot, that was quite confronting, because it wasn't just that a character had been killed, but we also knew that a person that we'd work with as a crew member and a cast member wasn't going to be there anymore. Even though sometimes some were resurrected or some played various different parts and came back as other characters. But we knew that at the end of Frankie Doyle, she was never going to come back. And we knew with Myra, she was never going to come back. And that had some kind of an influence on us. They were somber days when those sort of things happened. Well, going back to what you're talking about, the first hanging of that girl that ran around the corner and tripped over Frankie, that was confronting, because it was done in a way that had to make it look like she was really hanging. And that happened over and over and over again in all sorts of different ways. Bodies were discovered, fallen downstairs, pushed downstairs, or hidden away in various rooms and so forth and so on. And they were all confronting for us.
There were some pretty big scenes like that, which we will obviously discuss in further podcasts. We come to a scene where we're introduced to Mrs. Erica Davidson in the governor's office, Karen going in, and Erica Davidson played by Patsy King, because Karen's wanting to change cells because of Frankie and things like that. And I mean, I'm hoping we do have Patsy King come on, because it'd be great to speak to her and about her time on Prisoner. But it would have been amazing to work with Patsy.
She was a very gracious lady, and she had been in roles in other television series that I'd worked on. But this was different. This was 8 years of being part of a company. I remember one time at the end of a show, we finished early one day, and I think Fiona and Elsbeth and Patsy, they wanted to go down to the Burvale Hotel for a glass of wine afterwards and relax. And I said, oh, well, I'll drive you. And I remember the three of them, they all got in the back seat. And so I was in the front seat like their chauffeur. I was driving a Fairmont at the time.
Looking like an Uber driver.
Yes, and Patsy said, oh, this is a bit of luxury, isn't it? I thought, yes, well, you're probably easily pleased. You should have gone in Joe Battaglia's Rolls Royce. I think Joe had a Rolls Royce or a Jaguar, but I know whatever it was, he bought it off Graham Kennedy when Joe worked at Channel 9. Patsy was lovely. She was just such a nice and gracious lady. And there was a lot of Patsy in The Governor. She was a lot different in other ways too. Patsy'd been around for a while. She'd been in lots of different programs. I think she may have been even in shows like Homicide and so forth. She brought a lot of charm to that role, but of course she had to be hard and tough, not exactly cruel, but tough and fair, and she handled it very well. She was a professional, like pretty well all of the cast. They rarely ever blew their lines. It would be a technical problem, a boom in shot or a wrong camera or something moving that would stop the production, not them, not very often.
I mean, the writing was brilliant on the show. The characters were so believable, the way they all played them. Just see the character was so real. And that's what brings me to the next scene is we see the rec room for the first time. Vera tells Doreen that they're moving her to another cell, and Frankie starts getting angry at Vera. Now, this is a really full-on scene. Were you at that scene? This is where she smashes up the rec room.
Yeah, that scene, I don't think that was the one that had 3 cameras tied to it on separate video machines. I think that came later in later episodes, but it was certainly it was Frankie Doyle throwing another tantrum. Well, we see this for the first time this time. And again, 3 cameras, and we walked it through, we rehearsed it. Then you're moving at half pace. And then she would say, well, then I'll overturn the bookcase, and then I'll tip this table over, and then I'll push that over and throw things and so forth and so on. So we'd go through all that as rehearsal, and we rehearsed that a couple of times. Then would be a little break while Carol got herself into that kind of rage. And the interesting backstory to this was that character, to begin with, Frankie Doyle, yes, she's a lesbian, and yes, she wants to be top dog, and she's going to fight her way to do that and so forth. But there's a lot more to Frankie Doyle than that. There's the softer side of her, which would be developed eventually. For her to get to that, she had to take all that in. She has to know that there's this crazy person, this person who can't read and has a lot of self-image problems and feelings for Karen, and she's got to work all that together and get herself into a hitched up kind of rage. And of course she knows that, but we don't, the viewers don't. That has to come out through the length of her stay.
That's what I found like really brilliant about Carol, was that, yeah, she played that rage, but then you see scenes where, I mean, when she escaped with Doreen and they're on the run, she was really protective of Doreen, like it was a child. She had this soft side. And I found that really fascinating that she could play those 2 extremes of her heart.
So once she started, I mean, we knew what was going to happen. We knew that bookcases were going to be pulled out, tipped over and so forth and so on. But it's different when you walk it through, and when you're behind a camera and you've got to make sure that you catch everything that's happening and you don't miss out on some of the action. And you can't just rely on the other 2 guys on either side of you, because they're doing what they have to do. And when things are crashing and falling down and so forth, and we knew too that we probably wouldn't be able to do that scene a second time round, because it would take too long to put everything back together again, and we would have to move on. We were under a time schedule, so we had to bear that in mind. So
did you feel a lot of pressure being a part of the with those scenes, that you had to get them right from the first time, because there wouldn't be another opportunity to film it again?
Yes, and that happened to me at a later date, a long time later, when I had to do a scene which I blew, and we couldn't reshoot it on that day. I've never forgotten that.
Now, I just want to touch on, we come to the scene where we're introduced to Mum, played by Mary Ward, who is still alive and 106 years old. And she would be another amazing guest we'd love to have on. Now, there's a great scene with Mum and Lynn out in the garden. And I love the part where Lynn grabs the rose and the camera pans in on the rose, which is the whole theme song at the end. Do you remember much about Mary?
I wasn't aware that Mary was the age that she was. I only found this out later on, especially when she started to clock up 99 and 100, and she just keeps on going. She played the part of Mum in a kind of way, because she was a kind of settling influence on us. Anytime we kind of got a bit out of hand in between takes, she'd sort of calm things down a little bit. Just her presence there. I mean, she was a very tall lady and slender. She had that Mum feel about her. I can't remember how long she was in the series for, but she was very pleasant to be around. I never got to get close to her like I did with some of the others over a longer period of time. But calming would be what I'd say about Mary.
It was a great part. Again, a balance that they had on Prisoner, showing, you know, there was some really harsh characters, and then there was characters characters like Mum, who played that, that grandmother figure.
As opposed to characters who had good and bad sides, Mum was always fairly consistent. She was on that good shelf. That's where she slotted in. I don't think that there was ever any time where she showed any other side to her. Then there were others who were always going to be bad apples, thinking on later on into the series, and various people that came in as governors and so forth that could be nasty and turned out to be nasty.
I'm going to put you on the spot with something. The next scene is Frankie in solitary. Vera opens the trapdoor. Frankie tells her to piss off. Vera lights up the cigarette. Then we find out Frankie goes, there's a new nickname for you, Vera. Do you want to know what it is? It's Vinegar Tits, which she cops through the whole way that she's on the show. Do you know who actually came up with that name, Vinegar Tits?
I think one of the first and founding writers, one of those writers was Fiona's partner.
Was Morgan, was that right?
I think so. I think it was one of those early writers, because I know that Coral Druin later on created the Freak, but that was, I think Coral wasn't a writer to begin with in the series. So I would think Denise Morgan, probably the lady that came up with it. It's brilliant because it kind of showed in 2 words what the prisoner's perception of Fiona Spencer's character was all about. Just summated it beautifully. And of course, when Carol turns around and does that,
with
the actors do what they call business, and it can be anything to fooling with your hat or playing with your ear or doing a particular hand sign. But that one, I'm guessing, was Carol's bit of business, because she says the dialogue, but then the writers don't necessarily write in, and you put your hands up and turn your pants. That sort of thing is left a lot of times to the actress or actor. And so I feel that maybe Carol came up with that movement, which works beautifully.
But it's great because, as I said, every time there's a mention of Prisoner, about one of the stars or the cast, or, it's on TV, it's always a scene they play is the...
It also comes out in the dialogue, and the look on Fiona's face is, you'd like a cigarette, wouldn't you? But you can't because it's against the rules. And there you see part of that nasty side of that character coming out.
And Vera had never smoked on the show anyway, so she wasn't really a smoker.
No, I don't believe she was.
There's another scene which I want to talk about. So there was a lot that went on in episode 1. Bea is at the press and she gets Kerry Armstrong, Lynn Warner, her hand into the press and burns it. Were you there filming that one as well?
Yes. Because of Lynn's character, we got to a point where we called her Wonky Warner, because every time you saw her in those beginning episodes, she's always crying or snivelling, and she does such a good job creating that character. And that was always going to happen. You could see what was coming. It didn't surprise probably viewers because it was an accident that was going to happen. I mean, as soon as Bea's antenna goes up, when she realises that this prisoner is in for harming a child, that's when you know something's coming. Always going to happen. And what better instrument to do it? I mean, there are a lot of different times when the character of Bea could have whacked her or kicked her or tripped her or done all sorts of nasty things to her. But when she walks through that laundry door, you know what's going to happen.
It's on.
Yeah. And Slammo, it is sort of told to you, but when it happens, it's still a shock. You feel as a viewer that press is bloody hot, and steam and the force of the thing shutting down would be very, very painful. And that's the thing with Lynn Warner going out into the garden and finding Mum, that symbolic thing of the rose when they both exit the scene, or Mum goes away and Lynn's left there, that the camera zooms in to the rose is all symbolic of showing you, yes, we have the bars, but yes, we have the flowers. That's a very powerful kind of symbolism.
There's another scene which is a flashback to Peter Tapano coming home, finding her husband in bed with another woman. So we've just seen a prisoner have her hand stuck in the press and had it burnt. And now we're seeing Karen standing there with a massive kitchen knife, which we did discuss prior. It was like a scene out of the movie Psycho, and that she stabs her husband in the shower. And then she wakes up with Lynn sitting in her cell about her burnt hand. Did you find that scene confronting?
The thing at home with her husband, who I think was Rod Mulliner, that stabbing scene was shot on location, but it was confronting for anyone who saw it. Yes, there were shades of Psycho with the knife scene in the shower. Graham Arthur, who directed that first episode, was fully aware of the Psycho thing. In fact, according to what I've gleaned about it, he did get the camera guy, whether it was Joe or Steve, to actually tilt the camera down to the drain to see the blood running down the drain. But that was cut. And I think the reason for that was that the producers, and in this case, the producer, didn't want it to look too close to the Psycho scene.
Oh, so they did shoot the scene with the blood running down?
Yes, we never saw it. It was cut. And of course, we didn't have that iconic piercing music from Psycho, that but the message was there. She was provoked. He'd done so much to her, so many cruel things to her, including the cigarette burns on her back. And this was the final straw. And she just snapped. Now, we have to find that out, the expansion of that character that Peter played very well. And that all comes later in other episodes. But what you see there, first of all, at the beginning, with Peter crossing from Flinders Street Station and looking fairly happy, to change into a knife-wielding, yes, it took some pressure upon that character to build that to a point where snap. And most people have breaking points. You could understand why that happened. And of course, him happening to be in the shower and the knife, well, there was always going to be the comparison with Psycho, but we have to look at it as a separate entity. We have to see it for what it was then. It's a woman driven to, it's not a psychopathic person, a lunatic like Tony Perkins. This is her character snapping and doing something she would never have dreamed of doing in normal life. So that's why it was confronting, because you've got this fairly nice person, and she turns out to be, later when she reaches out her hand to Frankie and starts to teach her to read and that soft side of the character Karen, that's where you see the juxtaposition of this person who snapped, but back to a person who's in reality a very nice person. And of course, Peter carried it off beautifully.
Yes, she did. And that was the brilliance of the writing and the acting. I mean, it just went hand in hand with what they did. The final scene of episode 1 is where, we see some corruption already with the officers. So we see an officer late at night go into B's cell and let her out and go into Lynn's cell. And then that's the episode finished. So we've got to wait till episode 2 to see what happens. But it just shows that Prisoner is going all out, not just with the prisoners being bad, but the officers as well.
Yes, you can see the difference with the officers. There is the good screw and the hardened screws, but who are still not corrupt. And then we get to see just a glimmer of someone who is doing something that is absolutely against the rules. And this shouldn't happen. And it should not be a prison officer that does this. So we go the whole gamut of looking at the bad people and the good people that are forced into prison, and the bad people and the good people who are their jailers. And so just in one episode, we've got this microcosm of all these events happening. And that's what pretty well got people. I think episode 1 was what just made people go, hey, this is something. And we know, as they say in the well-worn cliche, what happened to follow was always going to happen. And the popularity, and that was the thing that made the channel dip from the depths up to suddenly being a contender. We'd seen glimpses of it with Matlock Police and so forth and so on, but this actually changed Channel 10. And people started to walk around just a little bit with a bit of the chest puffed out and just a bit higher off the floor, because we weren't just the underdogs. We weren't the bottom of the pile. And it was always 9 and 7 and 2 until O came in, 010. And then it was 9, 7 and 010 and 2 below us. It's no coincidence that in about 1980, or just before, when Channel O became Channel 10, the slogan promo was, "You're on top with 10." And that made everybody feel pretty good about themselves, because we actually literally were on the top at that time. And it was all because of Prisoner.
Wow, that was really insightful. And I thank you for that. And The next episode, you will have your hosting hat on.
There's a picture of me floating around somewhere on the internet with me with this on and shirt sleeves. The reason for that was because in the studio, you had to be free to work a camera, but you had to be warm, because outside of the sets, which were very hot, but on the outside of those, it was very cold, because they had to keep the air conditioning turned to cold as much as possible to give the cast a break when they came off sets. I won't be in this gear again.
Which is the original one.
Yeah, and I can still fit into it.
For the fans, I want to let them know that our next episode, we're going to be featuring none other than Jared Maguire, who played Officer Jim Fletcher. Now, he was the first male officer on the show and played the Deputy Governor. He's going to be our next guest, which is really exciting. So we're inviting any questions from fans. Please post them on our Facebook page, like our Facebook page, Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, which is under Talking Prisoner. You can make your comments there or post any questions. We'll go through them and ask them for each guest that we have on. That's about it. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Matt.
See you for episode 2.
Bye for now.